Some voices don't just sing, they confess. Behind the beats we dance to and the love songs we cry to are stories the world wasn't ready to hear. Many iconic Black musicians were also LGBTQ+, but lived in silence, coded their truth in lyrics, or let the music speak for them. This list isn't just about legends, it's about courage, heartbreak, and freedom. Once you know their truth, you'll never hear their songs the same way again. With a voice like silk and eyes full of mystery, Johnny Mathis was the embodiment of 1950s romance. Born the 30th of September, 1935, he crooned his way into America's heart with timeless hits like Chances Are and Misty. But while his ballads whispered of love, his personal truth was one he tucked away for decades. In a 1982 interview, Mathis casually mentioned being gay, but the backlash was swift. The quote was pulled, and Johnny retreated. It would take nearly 30 more years before he openly embraced his truth in public. Unlike others who burst out of the closet, Mathis tiptoed into the light, quiet, dignified, and gentle just like his music. And yet his courage was no less profound. In a world that once demanded silence, his whisper still mattered. Today, he remains a legend not just for his songs, but for surviving a career built on longing while quietly carrying his own. When Luther Vandross sang, the world swooned. His voice smooth, lush, aching could make anyone feel loved. Songs like Never Too Much and Here and Now weren't just hits, they were soundtracks to weddings, heartbreaks, and deep midnight confessions. But Vandross himself lived a life behind curtains. Born the 20th of April, 1951, he remained closeted his entire career, reportedly out of fear that coming out would destroy his career, especially in the Black church and R&B communities. After his passing in 2005, close friends like Patti LaBelle confirmed what many had long suspected. Luther was a gay man who never felt safe enough to say it aloud. And perhaps that's why his songs resonate with so much longing. Every note is a balancing act between love and hiding, desire and fear. He sang about romance for the world, but his own story remained untold. In that silence there is heartbreak, but in his voice there is truth. There's no one quite like Meshel Ndegeocello. Born the 29th of August, 1968, she exploded onto the music scene in the early 1990s, bald, bold, and genre-bending, fusing soul, funk, rock, jazz, and poetry with unapologetic honesty. She didn't ask the industry to accept, Hirsch dared it to catch up. An early-out lesbian in a hyper-masculine era, Meshel didn't soften her edges or erase her queerness. She confronted racism, homophobia, and toxic masculinity head-on in her lyrics. Her breakout single, If That's Your Boyfriend, He Wasn't Last Night, was more than chic, it was revolutionary. She's never been mainstream, and that's precisely the point. With 10 Grammy nominations, she's remained a critical darling and underground icon, refusing to fit in any box, not black, not female, not queer, not genre. Instead, she is the box breaker. In every guitar strum and whispered lyric, Meshel tells the world, you don't have to shrink to survive. In 2012, just before releasing Channel Orange, Frank Ocean did something extraordinary. Instead of giving an interview or a press tour, he posted a letter on Tumblr, a love letter, to a man. In a genre where hypermasculinity and homophobia still loomed large, Ocean didn't declare an identity, he simply shared a truth, that he had loved a man once deeply. And that moment cracked open the soul of R&B and hip-hop, revealing something tender, vulnerable, and radically honest. Born the 28th of October, 1987, Ocean has always been elusive. He rarely gives interviews, often disappears for years between projects, and seems allergic to fame. But when he sings, he says everything. Tracks like Bad Religion, Pink Plus White, and Nights aren't just beautifully written, they're emotional excavations, laced with queerness, not as spectacle, but as nuance, contradiction, and ache. Frank Ocean didn't need a rainbow flag. He needed space to whisper, and in that whisper, he gave a generation permission to be quiet, soft, fluid, and real. Born the 26th of April, 1886, Gertrude Ma Rainey wasn't just a singer, she was a force. She helped birth the blues, touring in vaudeville tents before recording more than 100 songs that laid the groundwork for American music. But what makes her legend even more electrifying is her openness about her love for women a century ago. In a world that barely allowed women to vote, let alone be queer and black and powerful, Ma Rainey defied all three. Her iconic 1928 song, Prove It On Me Blues, is still jaw-dropping in its defiance. Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women, 'cause I don't like no men. She didn't, she declared, and she didn't apologize. Clad in gold teeth, feathered hats, and fringed gowns, Ma Rainey was flamboyant, sexual, and self-possessed. She mentored Bessie Smith and influenced everyone from Janis Joplin to Lizzo. Even in death, she passed away in 1939 milliamperes, remains a touchstone for anyone who dares to be black, queer, and unbothered. If Ma Rainey was the mother, then Bessie Smith was the empress. Born in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1894, Bessie grew up on the margins poor, orphaned, and determined. Her voice smoky, rich, and aching carried her from the streets to sold-out theaters. She was soon the highest-paid black entertainer of the 1920s, and her records became lifelines for a generation coping with racism, poverty, and loss. And she lived just as loudly as she sang. Smith took lovers across the gender spectrum, and like her mentor, Ma Rainey, made little effort to hide it. In her circles, it was no secret. Her life was a mosaic of passion, defiance, and pain. She drank hard, loved harder, and refused to let society shame her desires. Her life was tragically cut short in 1937, following a car crash and a controversy over whether a segregated hospital denied her urgent care. But her influence on jazz, blues, and black womanhood can't be overstated. Nina Simone, Billie Holiday, Aretha Franklin, they all sang in Bessie's echo. Billy Strayhorn's name may not ring as loudly as Duke Ellington's, but his fingerprints are everywhere in American jazz. Born the 29th of November, 1915, Strayhorn was a classical pianist turned jazz visionary. He met Ellington in 1938, and from that moment on, the two were inseparable collaborators. Strayhorn penned the iconic Take the A Train and helped shape the lush, sophisticated sound that defined Ellington's orchestra. But while Ellington took the spotlight, Strayhorn preferred the shadows not out of modesty, but out of necessity. He was openly gay in an era when being so could end your career or your life. Yet he refused to compromise. He lived with dignity, dressed impeccably, and surrounded himself with queer artists and thinkers. His compositions like Lush Life, a haunting ballad of loneliness and resilience, tell the story of a man who understood sorrow deeply, but also beauty. He died of esophageal cancer in 1967 at just 51, but his music remains immortal. Every time a jazz quartet plays a melancholic night tune, Billy Strayhorn is there whispering elegance through the chords. If disco was a heartbeat, then house music was its resurrection, and no one gave it more soul than Frankie Knuckles. Born the 18th of January, 1955, in the Bronx, he moved to Chicago in the late 70s and helped create a new sound, a fusion of disco, gospel, funk, and electronic rhythm. But more than that, he created a sanctuary. The Warehouse, the now legendary club where Frankie DJ'd, wasn't just a party, it was a refuge for black and brown queer people cast out of churches, homes, and clubs. With pulsing beats and gospel-infused grooves, Knuckles didn't just make people dance, he made them feel saved. His sets were sermons, his turntables altars. The crowd wasn't just sweaty, it was seen. Frankie never shied from his queerness, even when the music industry tried to erase it. He lived and spun proudly. Even after his death in 2014, his legacy endures every time someone escapes into sound and finds freedom on a dance floor. He didn't just build a genre, he built a world where outcasts could finally feel like royalty. Few names scream rock and roll louder than Little Richard, the electric spark who ignited a global musical revolution. Born the 5th of December, 1932 in Macon, Georgia, Richard Penniman wasn't just an entertainer, he was a trailblazer who smashed the mold of what a black man in music could be. With his bouffant hair, sequin suits, and feverish piano pounding, Richard became a living contradiction, a queer black man preaching fire and brimstone, yet performing with flamboyant confidence that screamed freedom. His 1955 breakout hit Tutti Frutti, with its original raunchy lyrics, was unapologetically queer-coded before record executives scrubbed it clean. But even the sanitized version couldn't dull its electricity. It pulsed with camp, chaos, and unfiltered soul. Yet, Little Richard's life was marked by a painful duality. Raised in a deeply religious home, he felt eternally torn between his Pentecostal faith and his attraction to men. He denounced homosexuality publicly, even calling it unnatural, at times only to later express regret and return to his truth. He oscillated between preacher and performer, as if trying to reconcile the sacred and profane in his soul. But despite the torment, he never faded into the background. He remained loud, proud, and gloriously himself in a world that demanded silence. His influence echoes through artists from Prince to Bowie to Janelle Monáe. Little Richard didn't just open the door, he kicked it off its hinges. Before queerness was fashionable, before the mainstream dared to embrace gender fluidity, Sylvester was already there, sparkling, singing, and soaring. Born the 6th of September, 1947 in Los Angeles, Sylvester James grew up in the Black Pentecostal Church, where his passion for gospel harmonized with his emerging queer identity. Bullied and rejected by both family and faith communities, he sought refuge in music, drag, and the San Francisco queer underground of the 1970s. But Sylvester didn't want to be underground, he wanted to shine in daylight. With his breakthrough hit You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real in 1978, he did more than climb the chart sheet, redefined them. His falsetto was ethereal, his presence electric. He wore makeup, sequins, and gowns with the defiant grace of a warrior. For countless young LGBTQ+ listeners, especially those of color, he offered representation long before the word existed. Sylvester was also a fierce advocate during the early AIDS crisis, demanding visibility and dignity for his community. He insisted that his royalties support AIDS organizations upon his death, which tragically came too soon in 1988 when he succumbed to the disease at just 41 years old. But even now, his voice floats on dance floors, in drag shows, and in every moment someone queer decides to live loudly.